Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for those of us who showed up in the room. Thank you also to those who are participating via webcast. This is the second of two public meetings to discuss the revised proposal that the Governor's Office of Planning and Research developed to modernize the analysis of transportation impacts under CEQA. I am Chris Calfee, Senior Counsel at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Also here today at the other end of the table is my colleague Chris Ganson, who is Senior Planner and Technical Lead on this endeavor. We are also joined by a panel of experts in transportation engineering, local government infill development, academia, and advocacy. We'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves in just a few minutes. This proposal, as most folks know, was directed by Senate Bill 743 from 2013. Among other things, the legislature declared in that bill that transportation analysis in CEQA as it is currently practiced is inconsistent with other important state policies, including the development of sustainable community strategies as directed in SB 375. Specifically, recently enacted Public Resources Code Section 21099 states that auto delay or congestion is not an environmental impact under CEQA. Further, that section directed the Office of Planning and Research to develop changes to the CEQA guidelines to replace level of service as a measure of transportation impacts with a measure that better reflects both environmental impacts and other state priorities, such as greenhouse gas reductions, infill development, and increased transportation options. As directed by the statute, OPR quickly developed a first draft in 2014 that identified vehicle miles traveled as the most appropriate measure of transportation impacts. That first draft also provided recommendations on how to evaluate the significance of various types of projects using that metric. OPR then conducted extensive outreach to gather perspectives of those who would be subject to the new rules. It invited public comment for over a 4-month comment period. OPR staff also conducted hundreds of meetings and public workshops across the state, including here in Sacramento, as well as in Southern California and in the Bay Area. OPR staff also participated in conference panels in locations across the state, hosted by, among others, the California State Bar, the Association of Environmental Professionals, the American Planning Association, the League of California Cities, and others, in order to directly engage practitioners and experts in the field. Complete consensus failed to emerge. However, significant agreement did evolve on a number of key issues that we will describe in more detail later this morning. Having carefully reviewed all of the comments, OPR conducted further research and discussion with experts, and in close cooperation with the California Transportation Agency and Caltrans, OPR developed this revised proposal. OPR released the revised proposal on January 20th of this year and invited public input through February 29th, that's next week. Written comments are encouraged, however, OPR also seeks direct input. OPR has held 2 webinars earlier this month and a public meeting in Southern California last week. This is the second of 2 public meetings for that purpose. Before we dive in, I want to say just a few words about logistics. Let's see. First, the format of this meeting is a little bit different. Our objective for this meeting is to exchange information and perspectives on the potential implications of the revised proposal. To that end, we have invited an interdisciplinary group of experts to participate. After OPR staff presents a summary of the revised proposal, we will invite the panel to offer their observations and then invite comments from the public as well. We may ask the panel for their insight on public comments as well. Second, again, to facilitate information exchange, we invite clarifying questions about the proposal from participants, and we will answer those questions to the best of our abilities. For the lawyers in the room, please note this is not an invitation for cross-examination. Rather, our aim is to help participants understand the contents of the proposal. If you do choose to speak, we will ask you to please introduce yourself and your affiliation. Third, because this is an informal meeting, we are not transcribing it. However, please note it is being webcast and the webcast will be recorded. Finally, in order to ensure that we provide everyone an opportunity to speak, we may limit the time for each speaker if we get a flood of people coming into the room. At this point, I will turn the mic over to my colleague, Chris Ganson, to present the content of the revised proposal. Oh, before I do that, let me note, for folks that are participating via webcast, if you do have comments or questions, you can email them to ceqa.guidelines@resources.ca.gov. Thanks. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. I am going to, well, first the agenda for today, how the 2 hours will go. We've had a chance to welcome you all and provide some introductory comments about 743 and what we've done to implement it so far. I am going to give a presentation on some of the details of the guidelines and accompanying technical advisory. We'll then have a little bit of time for panelist response, but save most of the time for discussion, question and answer from folks who are in the room and on the webcast. So that's the arc of the next 2 hours. I'm going to leap right in and talk about what is maintained from our previous draft and what we've changed in our current materials. So what we continue to recommend, what we have not changed, first, that VMT is the primary metric of transportation impact statewide. Second, we recommend the use of VMT screening maps for residential and office projects. An example is here on the right. Third, we recommend presuming development near transit less than significant, and we provide some exceptions, suggest some exceptions to that presumption. A floor area ratio of less than 0.75, parking at greater than minimum requirements, and inconsistency with the SCS, we recommend invalidate the presumption of less than significant impact for development near transit. We continue to recommend that transit, active and active transportation projects are presumed less than significant. They tend to reduce VMT. And we continue to recognize in our materials that more stringent thresholds may be applied at lead agency discretion. So I'm going to go through some of the comments we received and some of the updates that we have included in the new materials in response to those. One comment we received widely was that technical advice is better given in a technical advisory than in the guidelines themselves, and so we moved our technical advice there. The new technical advisory, new to this round of release of the materials, is just that, a technical advisory. It does not, with the language not included in the CEQA guidelines themselves, it doesn't carry force of law, but it does provide a good amount of background recommendations and substantial evidence for lead agencies to use in implementing these guidelines. We received comments on residential project thresholds. Two major comments were that flexibility was needed in threshold setting and that average is not good enough for achieving state goals like greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So we updated our residential threshold recommendation to 15% below regional or city VMT per capita. That means that a city located in a high VMT area in its region nevertheless can refer to its own geography and therefore develop under the threshold, under our recommendations, in its travel efficient areas. Similarly, office projects, we received the comment that average for the threshold we were recommending, that average is not good enough for state goals, and so we updated our recommendation to 15% below regional VMT per capita. We focus on the regional geography here because commute trips tend to be longer than other trips taken on a daily basis and tend to cross city boundaries. So the regional geography is a good focus for office projects and commute trips. Gotten the question, why 15%? So first I want to add, or I should say reiterate that I want to reiterate that lower thresholds, that more stringent thresholds are by CEQA policy and CEQA law allowed for lead agencies. And the thresholds that we have recommended are essentially what we've as a result of a large number of convenings and discussions and looking across state policy, what we feel is in general alignment with state policy, and essentially using the thresholds that we recommend puts a lead agency on solid ground. Some of the documents we refer to are Caltrans Strategic Plan, which has a goal of reducing VMT per capita by 15% by 2020. SB743 targets, taken collectively statewide, are approximately a 15% reduction in GHGs per capita. AB 32 scoping plan recommends that local governments set GHG reduction targets at 15% below existing by 2020. And also research shows that 15% VMT mitigation is generally achievable for the sorts of projects that we have applied it to. For more details and research backing that CCAP COA's quantifying greenhouse gas mitigation measures, that document quantifies VMT reduction possible from various measures and how to combine, how to quantify the combination of VMT reduction measures as well as GHG. For retail projects, we received the comment that new retail doesn't necessarily or frequently doesn't create new trips, but rather redirects existing retail trips. In other words, when a retail land use is constructed, people don't go shopping anew, they generally shift their shopping patterns from somewhere else. So we updated our recommendation in light of that to retail being assessed with a net VMT approach, and that simply means looking at the VMT with and without the project in an area. Retail which increases VMT compared to previous shopping patterns, in other words, a retail development that leads to less travel efficient behavior, may be considered significant, while locally serving retail, which will tend to shorten trips and provide options for closer retail access, we recommend presuming that less than significant. Mixed-use development, we suggest, can consider each use separately, comparing to the thresholds for that use. Now, that doesn't mean that the mixed-use development components shouldn't get credit for being mixed use, which reduces VMT. In fact, we recommend that each use should take credit for internal capture due to proximity of other uses in the project. In other words, include internal capture. We also point out that much mixed-use development like that pictured here would receive under our recommendations a presumption of less than significant impact. For example, the housing component by being located in a transit area or in an area where other residential development exhibits below threshold VMT, that would be presumed less than significant. And if it contained locally serving retail, which this sort of development frequently does, that would suggest a presumption of less than significant impact for the retail component, so that the development as a whole would be presumed less than significant for its impact on transportation. Our last draft contained two methodologies for calculating the effects of induced travel from a roadway project. Both of them used travel demand models and adjustments for capturing the land use effects portion, which feed back into vehicle travel and need to be considered. We also recommended that general purpose lanes in the last draft might be reason for a significant impact, distinguishing them from managed lanes. The comments that we received were that first, the analysis might be burdensome for small transportation projects, and second, that using a project type could be problematic as a significance threshold. So we've updated our recommendation in a few ways. First, we've clarified the types of projects which might induce measurable or substantial VMT and those which wouldn't. And we have nearly a page-long list of examples of projects which wouldn't be considered to induce measurable or substantial VMT. VMT, we recommend now a VMT threshold rather than a project type threshold. So a certain amount of VMT is a threshold rather than the type of project. And in order to, the guidance that we provide on establishing that threshold is essentially to look at the VMT that we can have in the future and still meet our greenhouse gas targets, and the Air Resources Board has done some work estimating that. That work is still in progress, so the numbers that we provide in our guidance are draft. And then we recommend using a fair share threshold that VMT be allocated across all transportation projects. Finally, we recommend the use of a much simpler and easier to apply methodology using researched elasticities. So essentially, there is a sizable body of induced travel research, around 20 papers, and those find answers for an elasticity of percent increase in vehicle miles traveled per percent increase in lane miles added. So with data in hand, that we're working on obtaining from Caltrans. We've already obtained a lot of it. We haven't put it out in our materials yet, but hopefully it will be available for the full state soon. It's very easy to calculate the amount of additional VMT resulting from a certain addition of lane miles that a project may make. For land use plans, we have two recommendations. First, specific plans and other plans that are sub-jurisdictional. We recommend using the same methods and thresholds as for land use projects that we already went through. For general plans, we recommend consistency with a sustainable community strategy, and that's taken aggregate across the jurisdiction. For RTP SCSs, we recommend as a threshold sufficient VMT reduction to achieve the ARB specified greenhouse gas emissions targets. We heard the comment on our previous draft that rural is different and may, in some cases, have difficulty achieving the thresholds that we recommend. So we recommend that that thresholds be determined on a case-by-case basis as appropriate in rural areas of the state. Rural we define as non-MPO areas. We heard from commenters that there might be triggered, an EIR might be triggered for, significance might be triggered, and therefore an EIR might be needed for very small projects. So we update with a recommendation of a small project screening threshold at 100 vehicle trips per day. We heard a comment about, comments about that offered concerns about impacts to transit. And what we recommend there is the addition of riders itself is not an impact, but that blocking stations or routes may be an impact. We made significant changes in our recommendations around addressing traffic safety. And first, I want to say that SB743 specifies that existing traffic safety methodologies needn't be removed from CEQA. It does not recommend, it does not suggest doing additional traffic safety analysis. In our technical advisory, we also do not recommend additional traffic safety analysis. We do provide broad recommendations regarding approach on any traffic safety analysis that might be undertaken under CEQA. The recommendations we provide are based on a review, a much more extensive review of recent traffic safety literature, the literature that's come out in the past decade or decade and a half. And that literature taken together really points to four key strategies. The first is reducing motor vehicle speeds, which reduces both crash incidence and severity for all modes. Second, increasing driver attention, and that is a little bit of a different pathway from the traditional, traditionally implemented safety measures, which accommodate driver error rather than focusing driver attention. Third, protecting vulnerable road users. We've seen a decrease in fatality rate statewide for traffic collisions, but during that same time, in recent years, an increase in bicycle and pedestrian fatalities. And fourth, reducing overall vehicle miles traveled and sprawl. More vehicle miles traveled is more exposure to traffic collisions, and sprawl type development can both lead to increased VMT and also can be associated with the design of roadways that can undermine safety, particularly for vulnerable road users, but really for all road users. We provide substantial evidence and research in our advisory. For more details, please see the advisory and follow to the studies that we've pointed to in there. We recommend using caution. Measures which address safety by increasing automobile throughput or speed frequently create other safety issues, and also recommend being mindful of trade-offs that compromise vulnerable road user safety. A little bit on timeline. Public review ends in a week, February 29th, 2016. We are going to look through comments and incorporate them into a final proposal, which is not so final because it's going to the Natural Resources Agency for the formal rulemaking process, and that process provides the opportunity for additional comment. We anticipate SB743 being effective at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, and that will begin a 2-year opt-in period for lead agencies. Lead agencies can implement VMT as a CEQA metric at the outset or wait as long as 2 years, and that makes implementation required at the statewide in late 2018 or 2019. I'm going to talk briefly about a few other related topics. The first is that the statewide travel demand model data is available for VMT calculation. That is available at the URL at the bottom of this slide. That URL is linked also in our technical advisory materials. That data can be used for to input trip lengths into sketch models. It can be used for help setting thresholds, and it can be used for creating VMT screening maps. We anticipate the CSTDM being used as a backup set of data when regional level data is not available. A process is underway at Caltrans implementing SB743 and developing at-large transportation analysis guides and transportation impact study guidelines. So the traffic analysis guidelines will provide new methods for analyzing the effects of transportation projects. Transportation impact study guidelines will provide new approaches to characterize land use project impact on the state highway system. And that endeavor will benefit from broad stakeholder involvement. The contact at Neil Peacock is the contact for that project at Caltrans, and we recommend broad public involvement. His email address is here. For general plans and impact fees, SB 743 leaves existing impact fee programs in place. Local governments can develop VMT-based impact fee programs that can ease the CEQA burden and broaden types of improvements that can be funded. And a few words about our general plan guidelines, which we're also currently developing. We're recommending strongly against using the sort of ad hoc LOS-triggered project level mitigation that has frequently been used in CEQA for all the same reasons that we've articulated in developing the guidelines under SB 743. To see more detail on the reasoning, to retain time for question and answer today, we haven't given that background information, but we do have 2 webinars recorded on our website, and we share that reasoning in those. So please go ahead and take a look if you haven't seen those slides already. We recommend that LOS might still be used in helping to plan roadway capacity in conjunction with a different way of ascribing impact from projects, ideally ascribing it using vehicle miles traveled. In other words, the impact of the project is proportional to the amount of vehicle travel that it loads onto the roadway network. Ultimately, we recommend, and these metrics are under development, but they're close. They're being used in a few places outside of California at this point, so we have a little bit of catch-up work to do. But direct measures of access to destinations or accessibility, connectivity, those are all words for the same concept. How well people can get to places rather than just through intersections. And using those metrics to plan your network will give you better answers ultimately, still using VMT to estimate project impact we see as ideal. When planning transportation networks, we recommend, and doing this in the general planning context or in the planning context at large will facilitate it, we recommend balancing automobility with other interests, not just other modes, although certainly with other modes and their mobility and access to destinations, but also with cost, neighborhood vibrancy, walkability, air quality, greenhouse gases, human health, everything that a community cares about. With that, we're going to launch into a discussion. Well, first, I'll briefly introduce the panelists and allow them to introduce themselves in a little more detail and share some reactions to the materials that we have shared. And then we will talk through questions. We'll take questions, we'll take them as a full panel together. And we'll attempt to organize the conversation by topic as listed here on the slide, just so to make the conversation more coherent. But hopefully there will be time to get to any questions that anyone in the room or online has. So first I'll introduce the panel. Next to me is Jeannie Ward-Waller, Policy Director for the California Bicycle Coalition. Jeff Tumlin, next to her, principal at Nelson Nygaard Consultants. I think David Mogavero is next. He's an architect and infill builder at Mogavero Architects. We have Susan Handy, a professor at UC Davis, and Sarah Jones, Director of Environmental Planning, City and County of San Francisco. So you guys are each welcome to share a few minutes of your thoughts on this. Also, if you want to introduce yourselves a little bit more in a little greater detail, please feel free to do so. Jeannie, you want to start off?
Just push that. Okay. Sounds like you can hear me. Thank you, Chris. I'm excited to be here. Jeannie Ward-Waller. I'm the Policy Director for the California Bicycle Coalition. I am an engineer, civil engineer by background, but I've found my way into transportation policy advocacy because I love bikes. CalBike is a statewide organization. We really are focused on working with the state agencies here in Sacramento and the legislature and Caltrans. But we also represent local and regional bike coalitions around the state. And so I think through this process, we've reached out and had a lot of conversations with our local partners who are really involved on the ground at the project level with bicycle infrastructure and other development projects. And I think, generally speaking on behalf of the local coalitions as well as CalBike, we're really supportive of this shift away from level of service to using VMT as the metric for projects. I think specifically how this will provide an opportunity to really facilitate bicycle and pedestrian safety projects and more of the facilities of those type, as well as land use and development that supports mode shift toward using those facilities. We're just super excited about it. In addition, this is really going to help us implement sustainable community strategies that our local partners have been really intimately involved in with regional agencies around the state and help us to achieve broader state goals. We look forward to working with those partners as well as local and state agencies on implementing the change and monitoring how it's working. I think there are a couple of things we're going to be really mindful of. Chris already talked about the traffic safety impacts, and I think the technical advisory does a really good job of discussing how traffic safety should be considered moving forward, and we really support that, how the technical advisory lays it out, really looking to prioritize those most vulnerable users on our roadways. I think another thing that we're sort of monitoring and mindful of currently is there is some discussion happening in the legislature and with the governor's office around CEQA streamlining for maintenance and rehabilitation roadway projects. And many of those projects, of course, were designed and built in the era of level of service. So, we'll be monitoring how projects like that could potentially be, sort of reevaluated as they move forward using the VMT metric. So I'll pass it on to Jeff. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Tumlin. I'm a principal with Nelson Nygaard Transportation Planning. And as a transportation planner who's worked on CEQA analyses for 20 years, I know that our past CEQA planning conventions have been really good for business for our transportation consultants, but really bad for California. And I will, let me just say, not be sad to not have to do a 200-page traffic analysis that nobody is going to read other than my fellow consultants and real estate attorneys. I think my greater concern, though, about our past conventions is when you look at using level of service and a level of service approach to solve our traffic problems, the problem is that the solution is to accommodate unconstrained rates of driving and to make it that much more difficult to walk and bike and take public transportation. That an over-reliance on level of service actually creates the very problem that it was intended to solve by accommodating endlessly more driving and making it more difficult to walk and bike and take public transportation. And so this over-reliance on level of service not only has exacerbated regional traffic congestion in its attempt to solve localized traffic congestion, but it has also worsened our ability to meet our greenhouse gas emissions goals. And so finally, OPR is putting into alignment the greenhouse gas section of CEQA with the transportation section of CEQA. I think that the current work that has been done, particularly the recent, the most recent edits, are really solid, but I would also point to two sections where some additional caution is needed. One is on the topic of safety. It is not possible to argue against safety, but I would say that safety is not necessarily the best thing for CEQA to be looking at. It's important to keep in mind that CEQA is not a tool for good planning. It is a legal disclosure instrument. And safety is something that is very easy to measure after the fact, but quite difficult to predict in advance. More importantly, I can bring in two expert witnesses, people with excellent credentials, one of whom will argue that wider 14-foot travel lanes are the safest, and another that would argue that narrower, tighter 9-foot travel lanes are the safest. And under CEQA, it is up to the courts to adjudicate which expert is correct. And so safety introduces a certain amount of uncertainty in a CEQA analysis that allows good projects to become vulnerable and for the potential for far worse safety outcomes to be enforced by the courts because the courts are not experts in this topic. That said, I think OPR does an excellent job of trying to avoid some of the unintended negative consequences of using inappropriate safety methodologies, particularly in an urban context. I think that OPR should go a step further and to clarify in particular that queuing from a left turn pocket or onto a highway is to be addressed with the most extreme caution. If we define queuing as the primary safety implication of a roadway project, then we're taking level of service out with the one hand and putting it very much back in on the other hand. Because the solution to a queuing problem, if it's from a left turn pocket or from an intersection back onto a highway, is to widen that highway, or to eliminate the pedestrian crossing, or to eliminate the bike facility, because those pedestrians and cyclists are what are getting in the way of cars being able to clear the intersection quickly. So again, be very cautious if you're a local jurisdiction, exactly how you are defining safety and making sure that you don't have the same unintended negative consequences with safety as we did with over-reliance on level of service. Another point of caution as well that I think is going to require some additional thoughtfulness is on the topic of induced demand, a topic that is extremely important and something that was sort of the fundamental underlying flaw of our reliance on level of service. Again, OPR in the technical advisory section does an outstanding job of summarizing current research and applying some simple methodologies that can be used in order to allow local jurisdictions to do the roadway widenings that they need to do in order to accommodate their growth. Particularly the metropolitan planning organizations and the county congestion management agencies will need to have very clear guidance about exactly how the topic of induced demand is to be handled in those jurisdictions, and will also likely need to be the organizations that provide the necessary cover so that municipalities can do the road widenings that are needed and justifiable based upon population and job growth, while at the same time implementing at the regional scale the things that we need to do in order to get control over induced demand.
Good morning. There we go. Good morning, everyone out there. I'm glad there's some people in the audience so we have some sort of physical connection here. So David Mogavero, I'm an architect dominantly. I also do real estate development and am a board member of the Planning and Conservation League. When the Planning and Conservation League first proposed an LOS to VMT legislation in 2012, it was intended to be a performance criteria for all development throughout the state outside of the CEQA environment. I want to thank OPR staff, the governor, and Senator Steinberg for picking up that concept, seeing its value, and carrying forward with it as a modification to the CEQA environment because it fixes, as Jeff very clearly articulated, a serious flaw with the use of LOS. So our motivation when we proposed that legislation was exactly as Jeff identified, but a little bit further. Just a reminder to everyone that transportation planning is not just about access, mobility, or moving vehicles. It is also about the fabric of the community for children and other vulnerable users in the community. It also was a huge economic issue. It has many ramifications that go way beyond transportation, and shifting from LOS to VMT is going to be a significant step in addressing those comprehensive issues as well. I think we need to recognize that this is a very, very complicated issue. It's one that has many dimensions to it, that finds its way into the fabric of the essence of what we do with our community planning on many, many different levels. I think that OPR has done a great job taking input on their first draft and coming up with a second draft that is very consistent with the intent of the legislation, capturing many, many of the issues and addressing many of the potential complications, but it is not going to be perfect. There's going to be flaws that we're going to find. I'm sure there's people that are already saying, well, you can't measure this, you can't measure that, et cetera, but we are going to see problems as things go on, and I'm expecting that perhaps in another 3 or 4 years there might be some amendments to this to fix some of those problems, because anytime you're introducing a new set of rules, you are going to find that it's not perfect. So I think the big challenge for this upcoming is going to be implementation. The dilemma is that there is a culture that is 1,000 miles deep as some of the old glaciers that used to cover North America, around LOS on a lot of different levels. Everybody that is a transportation planner or a transportation engineer has come out of schools where they've been trained around this fabric. Thank God for people like Elizabeth Deacon and Susan Handy that are doing otherwise. We have a culture, therefore, in our planning departments, in our engineering departments, at local government and regional government that is insidiously involved in this old metric. The other is that we have all kinds of funding programs that are structured around it as well. And changing that culture is going to be very, very, very difficult. I encounter it every day in my practice. We have 15 projects under construction right now, and every single one of them has been touched by some dimension of this issue, oftentimes to the negative because of that old culture that is a promoter of moving vehicles as fast as possible and as many at a time. So I think that's where the challenge is going to be, and I am hoping that there may be some mechanism for OPR to monitor what's going on with local government, and perhaps there might need to be some follow-up legislation to ensure that this cultural shift is in fact taking place. Susan.
Thank you. I'm Susan Handy. I'm a professor at UC Davis, where I also direct the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And I've been doing research on the connection between land use and auto dependence for a couple of decades now. But more recently worked with Marlon Bornett on reviewing all of the empirical evidence out there on various strategies that our community is adopting for reducing VMT. So I'm going to speak a little bit about kind of the research role in all of this. And if you're not familiar with the work that Marlon and I led, it was for ARB, and if you Google SB743 research, you will find it. So one of the challenging things when we were doing that project was that we kept getting pushed to by ARB and others to give the number. What is the effect size? If you do mixed use development, how much difference is that going to make? If you invest in bicycle infrastructure, how much difference is that going to make? And the nice thing about being an academic is we could just say, hey, we can't answer that question. Here's the evidence we have, but I can't tell you what the effect is going to be in any particular situation. So I'm glad that was not my job, and that the OPR to figure out how to translate the evidence into practical guidance about how to do these estimations. And I want to commend OPR for, I think, doing a very good job of providing practical guidance that really is based on a solid foundation of empirical work, such as it is. Now, I will say that although, when I look at the evidence, I get a little squeamish about settling on specific numbers, I do feel very strongly about the solidity of the empirical evidence that underlies the stuff that we're talking about here. So it is by no means perfect, and you can point to any particular study and find issues with it. But on all of these topics, the body of evidence is very strong that these various strategies do have an effect on reducing VMT. So I think we're on very safe ground with the kind of guidance that's been given in knowing, or at least estimating, that certain kinds of projects are going to be producing. That said, the evidence is better on some strategies than others, and you'll see that in the documents that we produce. And it's clear that we need to continue to be doing research on these various. So that means collecting more data, and it means that as communities around California put various strategies in place, approve certain kinds of projects, other kinds of projects, that we are collecting as much data as we can to be documenting what the true impacts on VMT are of these various approaches. That's something that I think it's hard for communities to do themselves, but I would hope that various universities around the state to be helping them with these better build the evidence base as we go. And then, you know, I think the big challenge, as David suggested, is that, you know, we're going to be learning, right? That this is not going to be a static thing, that this practice is going to have to evolve over time as we learn more, as the evidence builds. We are in the process of turning the evidence into practical tools that communities can use to do the VMT estimation. Long ways to go in terms of developing those tools and really testing them out and improving them over time. And then along with that is this challenge of changing the culture. Such well-established, standardized practice for estimating impacts on level of service. But we're really just at the starting point for doing that for VMT. So I'm looking forward to being a part of this evolution as
Thank you. It was just by chance that we sat in the order that we did, but I think it's actually really good because I'm here to talk about the implementation side and how we are going to put these new guidelines into practice. So I'm Sarah Jones, Director of Environmental Planning at the San Francisco Planning Department. My division and the Planning Department in general serve as the CEQA lead agency for all projects within the city and county of San Francisco. So that's all private development plus all public projects on San Francisco controlled lands, which actually stretch all the way up to the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. We issue about 5,500 CEQA determinations every year. At any one time, we probably have about upwards of 25 or 30 EIRs going on, you know, negative declarations, obviously, and we do a lot of tiering off of programmatic EIRs. So we cover a big range of CEQA practice. In terms of the new guidelines, I have 2 teenagers at home, and what I tell them is if they're ever in a situation that they're not very happy about and they want to get out of without embarrassing themselves, they can blame it on mom and dad. And now I'm finding myself in the very happy position of being able to blame the mom and dad of OPR for letting us stop doing level of service. In fact, we are so happy about this situation that we're going to our planning commission next week to ask them to please let us listen to mom and dad and make this change right away and not wait for this process to play out at the state level. And we have a specific set of conditions in San Francisco that are allowing us to do that. We have actually been working on making this change for about a dozen years now. So we are more than ready to do it. So I'm not suggesting that every city is ready to make this leap right away, but there are a few things from our experience that I think could be useful as messages and then also as support for other cities in the state. One of them is we have a pretty robust website about this, a lot of evidence, a lot of arguments. Feel free to crib as needed to use it in staff reports and use it in your own arguments before elected and appointed officials. The other piece of it is that we are making this change in concert with a really broad change in our transportation impact analysis and transportation planning strategy. So we are also in the process of adopting a robust evidence-based transportation demand management ordinance. And we are essentially taking much more active steps than we ever have to reduce VMT. Now, San Francisco is already at about half the regional average VMT, so we are anticipating that our projects are going to be less than significant under the threshold, but that's still not good enough to keep our system moving the way we want it to and reach the kind of transportation goals that we need to be able to reach. So, so we are putting these TDM measures into place. I think that that is an approach of dealing with TDM by ordinance rather than by mitigation that communities may want to consider, and is just a strategy to look into. In terms of the guidelines themselves, I would say that we are actually, as an agency, most excited about the changes for transportation projects. San Francisco is the jurisdiction that infamously had to do an EIR on a bicycle plan. And we are very much looking forward to being able to facilitate and implement really key improvements that make our streets better places for people and better places to get around in all ways. So, you know, for example, this change is allowing us to go forward with a crucial safety improvement on one of the highest injury corridors in San Francisco. We would have had to do an environmental impact report on it. And now if we are able to make this change sooner, we are going to be able to pursue that project without an EIR. So that's very exciting for us. And then in terms of concerns, I would say that on an implementation side, our biggest challenge is going to be the tiering that we do and the EIRs that are still in effect that used level of service and identified level of service as a significant impact. So we're going to have to figure out how to reconcile those two issues. But that is where we are right now. It's a very exciting time for us and for the state. And thank you, OPR.
Thank you all. Let's begin.
If I can just say a couple more words. Thanks, Chris. So thank you very much to our panel for sharing your thoughts. Again, for those participating in the room or on the webcast, we invited these panelists because they've done a lot of very deep thinking on these issues and can help us engage in a dialogue with participants here in the room and on the webcast. It goes without saying, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway, that the views expressed by the panel belong to the panelists and they don't necessarily represent those of OPR or the administration. It also goes without saying that these folks have added a whole lot of depth to this discussion. So thank you very much for that. Now is the time, though, that we do want to hear from participants in the room and on the webcast. So my colleague Chris will lead that discussion.
Microphone. Thank you, Chris. Let's start with some questions, both from in the room and from on the webcast. Chris, can you give the email address once again? I'm not sure if folks can see that online.
Yes, thanks for that. It's CEQA.guidelines@resources, .ca.gov.
Great. So you can email questions to that address. And let's organize the conversation in the order of the presentation, although we don't need to be too strict about it, starting with residential, office, and retail projects, talking about that, followed by roadway projects, transportation projects in general, if there's interest, the kind of catch-all plans, rural, small projects, impacts to transit, and then safety, and leave a little time, hopefully, at the end for general discussion. So let's start with the room, the folks who made the effort to come in. Are there any questions or comments on residential, office, or retail projects in the room? And seeing none here, how about online? Oh, do we have one? Sorry, I moved too quickly. Oh, we have a microphone for you here, so you can actually, ask from your chair. Or wherever you want to in the room. It's wireless.
Check. I think we're on. Yeah, there we go.
Yep.
Just for, again, a quick reminder, the benefit for the panel and those online, just your name and affiliation, please.
Hi, Joshua Stark with Transform. Thank you all. This has been a very enlightening discussion, and we're really interested in seeing the next steps for this. I also sit on a tiny commission in West Sacramento, the Transportation, Mobility, and Infrastructure Commission, and really excited to pass this along for our March meeting as well, and try to push West Sacramento and a little way up front as well, maybe ahead of San Francisco. My question is in regards to, this is in general, a CEQA designation and a CEQA conversation. What impact might this have on rehabilitation of roadways currently, within, say, the SHOP projects at Caltrans, and the potential for CEQA exemptions in the future under, say, the governor's recommendations for new funding for transportation? So just kind of how negative declarations and other exemptions play into this entire conversation moving forward. Thank you.
I have some quick observations on that. Pardon me. I mentioned at the outset that we worked very closely with the California Transportation Agency and with Caltrans on this revised proposal. And one of the reasons for that is to make sure that as a state, our transportation policies are aligned. So what you'll see in our revised proposal is among the many projects that are identified as having a potentially less than significant VMT impact include those that are just maintenance of existing roadway infrastructure. So if it's not adding additional capacity, but is instead to maintain existing roadway infrastructure, that would not typically be considered to have a significant VMT impact. That is separate from other initiatives that I can't comment on right now. But as far as a VMT transportation impact, our proposal is to say less than significant.
That brings up a follow-up question then in regards to what kinds of impacts or maybe being grandfathered in those things that we now have new data on. But looking at maintenance, does this create some kind of disincentive to consider VMT impacts of systems, of current systems, in addition to?
The underlying CEQA rule when looking at whether a project would have impacts is to compare the proposed project to the existing baseline. So if the existing baseline is a roadway that is crumbling, then you would look at what is the effect of actually just paving or maintaining that roadway. Correct. Even if the project has been around for a long time, the question is what would happen as a result of your proposed project, and if your proposed project is to just maintain that old roadway, that's what you would be looking at.
Shall we take a question from online?
Yes, so the first question from our webcast viewers, and thank you for that, is a question about how to evaluate construction impacts when the project would primarily, say, a new power plant or new infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure project that would not typically have much in the way of operational traffic.
Okay, Chris Ganson here. I'll give a quick beginning of an answer, and then anybody on the panel who has thoughts, please chime in. We don't provide specific guidance around construction traffic. So our guidance is focused on where the bulk of the VMT is generated or induced, in other words, in residential office and retail projects, and then transportation infrastructure projects. We've had the constraint that we can't, it's just not feasible to try and provide guidance for every sort of project. And construction travel can be, is by definition more ephemeral. So we haven't gone into that. But any thoughts from the panel?
The bonehead observation that the quantity of construction trip generation compared to the life cycle trip generation of a project is infinite.
I'll add that the guidance does recommend doing a qualitative analysis if that's appropriate. And the reason we say that is when you look in the definition of thresholds of significance currently in the CEQA guidelines, it refers to both qualitative and quantitative measures. Under a qualitative analysis, one might want to consider whether it's possible to include carpooling options for construction workers and things of that nature. But again, qualitative is not looking at doing a model run necessarily on construction impacts.
In terms of construction traffic, I can say what we do now because we don't intend to change it under the new guidelines. We don't typically consider the traffic generated by the construction activity in and of itself to be reaching any kind of threshold of significance. What we are looking at, which I think is appropriate under CEQA, is the physical impacts of construction activity, both from the construction equipment and also from the truck trips. So we do air quality analysis on construction, which in my view is the appropriate way to address it.
Thanks. And Chris Ganson, I'll just chime in again briefly that SB743 doesn't affect analyses of air quality, noise, and other effects that might result from construction. Those analyses for construction or operations remain in place.
Chris, is it possible to identify the asker of the question so we can understand context a little better?
Yes, the last questioner was Andrew Tang from BART.
Thank you.
Shall we take another question? Any additional questions in the room? I see a couple. 1, 2, please. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Because I'm holding so much paper here. My name is Christina Lawson. I'm a land use attorney with Manat, Phelps & Phillips, and our group practices across the state of California. One of my question doesn't fit nicely into one of these categories, unfortunately, but it's along the same lines of the construction impacts question, which is that there are a wide variety of project types that are not addressed in the new guideline or in the technical advisory. And just thinking of a handful, event center type projects, port projects, airport projects, where many of those projects would induce measurable or substantial VMT. Is the thinking from OPR that those types of projects will be the types of projects that lead agencies develop individualized thresholds for as they proceed? And then what also is the thinking for projects, whether they be residential, office, or retail, that may actually impact event center, for example, we'll use that as an example, may have an adverse impact on traffic in the region that is only measurable by an LOS standard. So I'm thinking, for example, say Levi's Stadium and a new project, a hotel project comes online that does have significant LOS impacts near that event center. How are we then to measure those, because they may not have any measurable VMT impacts, for example?
Chris Ganson, I'll give a part of an answer and then pass the baton along to others on the panel. First, we recognize that jurisdictions, lead agencies, the public, there's still a lot of care out there about motor vehicle operations. All SB 743 does is move that study outside of CEQA, so into the planning process. And one of the big advantages we see of that is that there are trade-offs whenever automobility is provided, and the planning context allows those trade-offs to be weighed. So whatever the project type, doing good planning outside of CEQA, where again the different interests can be weighed, we see value in that. As far as guidance for other project types, as I mentioned, I think we've covered a good share of the urban fabric with our guidance, but of course not all of it. Yes, we do see lead agencies developing their own methods and significance thresholds particularly for other sorts of uses. But I think in many cases they'll be able to draw from the recommendations we provided for uses. So the sorts of developments that draw customers or attendees, even if they're not retail developments, might use our retail methodology as a starting point. A hotel land use, for example, might start with residential as a starting point. So of course, we didn't have the capacity to, and I don't think people would have wanted us to write hundreds of pages of guidance for every possible land use, but that's a little bit of how we see it evolving. Others?
So I would just add that, for example, for a use like an airport or a special event center or an arena or a stadium, those are the sorts of uses that would typically go through a conditional use permit process, which is a much more flexible and thoughtful analytical approach than CEQA, which is a rather blunt instrument. So as Chris just mentioned, Senate Bill 743 doesn't eliminate the use of level of service. Municipalities and lead agencies will continue to use level of service in their process of figuring out how to optimize signal timing and manage intersections. It simply will not be used within the constraints of CEQA. So we'll use level of service and weigh it against other performance metrics like pedestrian quality of service or different analytical approaches for safety, and manage big, odd things like arenas through a more comprehensive planning approach that is not possible to do within CEQA.
I'd like to follow up, if I can, with maybe you answered this, maybe you didn't, but would you address the presumption that you would need to default to LOS in those kinds of situations?
So level of service is a useful performance indicator. It tells us the average seconds of delay that a motor vehicle experiences in the peak 1 hour as measured off of the peak 15 minutes. So as a metric for figuring out how to optimize your roadway system in the peak 1 hour, it's a useful tool. But that's all that it does. And the problem with CEQA is it's relied on this single indicator to the exclusion of others. And because, again, it is a legal disclosure instrument rather than a planning tool, CEQA forces us to default to effectively to worst case scenarios and then to accommodate the worst case. So it's a blunt instrument. So in the case of an analysis that we might do for a conditional use permit, we would look at level of service and weigh that against our goal of accommodating bikes and pedestrians, weigh that against the seconds delay for other modes of transportation. We might actually look at person delay rather than vehicle delay, because of course level of service says that a person alone in a car is worth 40 times the value of somebody on a 40-person bus. So a more systematic analysis could be done, again, for example, through a conditional use permit process that is currently not possible under CEQA. And a conditional use permit process could start with an analysis of what exactly the local values are, how each of those values would be quantified, and to what degree any of those values could be compromised against another, recognizing that in cities, our work is primarily about resolving tensions.
If I could add to that, because we recently went through an EIR for an event center next to a hospital or very close to a hospital. And we did level of service analysis. And from a CEQA standpoint, the level of service analysis didn't really serve any purpose. From the standpoint of making sure that this was a workable situation and that these two uses could be compatible with one another and that we could design the project and its transportation demand management and other transportation measures in a manner that would keep the hospital able to operate as it should, it was absolutely critical to have that information.
I'll just briefly add from the legal standpoint. SB 743, it did say that it said that we needed to make a shift from level of service to something else. It put that something else in OPR's court. So OPR has said that the something else is vehicle miles traveled, and that would be your primary metric for analyzing transportation impacts. 743 did not direct us, it didn't authorize us to impose thresholds of significance, but it did suggest that we should provide guidance on determining significance. And we have proposed recommended thresholds in a technical advisory on a couple of areas where that makes sense. But for those other types of projects that, beyond the ones where we've described thresholds, CEQA maintains the discretion in the lead agency to pick its methodology and to pick its thresholds. The general rule in CEQA is in 15064 that when determining significance, the lead agency has to make a judgment call based on all of the information that it has in front of it. We have a couple of, unless there, oh, there is another question in the room.
Brief. So my name is Chanel Fletcher, and I am with Climate Plan, and we are a network of partner organizations that are really focused on implementing sustainable, equitable communities. And so we are in huge support of 743, and I think have weighed in multiple times on how I think supportive we are of the change to VMT. I think one concern that I would be remiss in not saying that has come up in our coalition really is around low-income communities and gentrification and displacement. And I'm sure that you guys on the panel have already heard these concerns. And I think just because I'm here, I do feel like I have to say them. And so people are really concerned that this is in effect weakening CEQA, and that it's going to streamline projects that will increase housing costs and actually take away the voice of sharpening some of those projects through the CEQA process. And so I think at Climate Plan, as much as we are in support of this, I think we definitely plan to submit comments that show that we do kind of want to hear from this panel, how can these guidelines ensure that displacement, I mean, I think it may happen, but how do we kind of mitigate that? How do these guidelines highlight best practices? How do we promote affordable housing? I think those are the questions that we really want to kind of hear back from you guys to ensure that our whole coalition can fully support and get behind this guidelines.
Chris Ganson here. I'll give a couple quick answers. It's a great topic and a rich one. One thing that SB743 will do, and one thing we see happening in an SB743 world, is the provision. It'll streamline the provision of transit and active transportation projects, and that's low-cost transportation. So frequently now we're looking, increasingly I think, we're looking at not just housing costs, but transportation costs, which is the next biggest cost to most families. And to the extent we can provide low transportation costs for families, we've made their living more affordable. I'd also point out that affordable housing exhibits lower VMT than standard rate housing, so that can be factored in as well. Others?
Thoughts? Thank you. Chris's point is is really an important one, because theoretically, anyway, this set of guidelines will redirect investment into transportation systems that provide better access for low-income households with better transit, bike safety, etc. And that's a really important point, because, as you know, the combination of the cost of housing and the cost of transportation are the two biggest pieces of any low-income family's budget. We do a lot of affordable housing in our practice, and we have clients all around the state, and a lot of them are relying heavily now upon the AHSC program, which was thankfully very much influenced by Transform, and I want to express my appreciation for that. And what we're finding is that the guidelines for that funding program have ratcheted up what we need to do to make sure that families are being located in a manner where it's going to provide them the greatest level of access to all of their needs, whether it be services or jobs or things of that sort. So guidance to programs that direct housing to the right places is important. And then I think beyond that, a lot of this question goes beyond what what a program of this sort or regulations of this sort can really do. It's really about what is local government doing, what is the state doing to provide access to more affordable housing, and that's primarily going to be in the form of dollars, is the most important piece of it. And I think that there's advocacy that has to be done in that realm beyond what's going on around these VMT guidelines.
So this is Jeff Tumlin with Nelson Nygaard again. I would add that our current level of service orientation says that it is always bad to do infill development near transit because there is existing traffic congestion there, and a level service threshold basis means that whenever you're doing infill development, you're going to trip a level of service threshold. And so it is always better to do development where there is not existing traffic congestion, because going from level of service A to D is just fine, but going from D to E is really bad. So if these 743 changes are implemented correctly, it will make it a lot easier for us to produce a lot more housing closer to transit, therefore reducing both housing costs and transportation costs, particularly for low-income households, really for households at all income levels, if we do it right. Now that said, I think it's important to emphasize again what CEQA is and what it's not. CEQA is not a tool for making California better. It is a legal disclosure instrument. All CEQA is intended to do is to disclose potentially significant negative impacts to the environment and try to reduce those impacts. So it's a very useful tool for us, but it's not the right tool to meet all of our objectives. There are other planning processes, tools, funding instruments, design guidelines that we also need to fix in order to get at the root of many of these problems, not just our transportation problems, but particularly our housing affordability problems. So here in California, a tool like the specific plan is a really useful tool for doing integrated planning that could try to make our communities better, rather than what CEQA does, which is largely to slow down the pace by which everything gets worse. Right? We need to focus on tools for making California better, and CEQA is a part of that, but it can't lead on the better side.
Thanks.
Just one other thought is that what this tool does do is increase the incentive to reduce parking. And when you're doing housing near transit, it is hopefully quite dense, and the cost of parking is quite extraordinary. The difference between a parking space in a surface lot could be $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 at the most, whereas a structural parking space could cost $25,000, $30,000. And by reducing parking costs, that will impact the cost of housing significantly.
Yes, if I could add to that. First of all, I entirely agree with Jeff. The Venn diagram overlap between CEQA and the very real and major issue of displacement and gentrification, that overlap is very small, and the overlap with SB743, I think, is even smaller. If you want to get affordable housing faster, the best thing you could do would be to provide a statutory exemption in CEQA for it so that CEQA doesn't apply to it at all. In terms of parking, one of the most powerful ways to reduce VMT is by reducing parking provision, and that is what our Transportation Demand Management Ordinance in San Francisco is pretty much geared on. It rewards reduction in parking, and it penalizes over provision of parking. And the luxury housing developers are the ones who are most concerned about their ability to comply with this ordinance. So it's setting out a very good direction around these issues of affordability, but it's the smallest tool really to deal with it.
Since we talked about parking, I do want to move on to a question from Andrew Tang, again at BART, on the parking question. So our proposal includes a presumption of less than significant impacts for land use projects that locate within a half mile of transit. Our technical advisory suggests a couple of circumstances where that presumption might not apply, including when the project is overparked. In other words, when it provides more than the minimum amount of parking. The question is, what about those jurisdictions where there is neither a parking minimum nor a maximum? What should we say in that circumstance? And since Jeff is nodding his head, I might call on him.
I had the same concern. I certainly agree with Sarah that the most powerful indication of a project's per capita VMT is related to its supply of parking. And the most powerful way of reducing a project's VMT in any circumstance is not only constraining the supply of that parking to match your desired VMT, but also removing subsidies of parking so that the motorists who use the parking also pay for that parking, and households with fewer cars can be rewarded by being able to afford more housing. That said, I recognize that there is a tension in the guidelines in that you, at the state level, you can't reward projects for violating the zoning requirements of local jurisdictions that have excessive minimum parking requirements. Similarly, you don't want to penalize projects that are providing the right number of parking spaces in a community that no longer has minimum parking requirements. And so it's a tricky area. My recommendation would be to take a similar approach as you have with induced demand and actually have some recommended parking ratios for different contexts within California, or to provide a range of contexts so that a community that has grossly excessive minimum parking requirements ends up having a CEQA problem that they've got to address, which is correct. And a project that is developing a modest amount of parking in a community that has no minimums and a low maximum isn't necessarily punished for building the parking that they need and the right amount of parking that matches up with their expected vehicle trip generation. And we can certainly help you looking at the data around the state to see the difference in what the recommended ratio might be. One thing that we've been continually surprised at is even in relatively rural parts of California on small town main streets, just how low peak cumulative parking demand is in a mixed use district. We have never seen it above 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet, even in parts of the state that are requiring 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, and in some cases 14 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Even in a place like downtown Santa Monica, the peak cumulative parking demand in a place that is heavily retailed and where everyone drives is only 1 space per 1,000.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. Obviously, it's a very good question, and it's something that we need to do some more thinking on. We did have another question from the webcast. This one comes from Eric Ruhr from VRPA Technologies, and he asks about the potential for a conflict between a CEQA analysis using vehicle miles traveled and a general plan analysis that still uses level of service. The answer is that, in my view, but I welcome thoughts from the panel as well, that those are actually 2 different questions. The analysis for environmental impact will be looking at vehicle miles traveled. Now, if the general plan requires a certain level of service or a certain level of capacity on the roadway, the project will still need to comply with the general plan with whatever those requirements are. To the extent that those general plan requirements themselves have an environmental impact, that would also need to be analyzed under CEQA. The question from Eric was further refined to say, what about when you have when you're talking about land use projects within a half mile of transit, and we presume a less than significant transportation impact? Would a conflict with a general plan level of service policy create an impact by itself? And I'll say there is a question in Appendix G about conflicts with general plans and other plans. The question always is there an environmental impact that comes from that conflict with a plan? Here, 743 said that auto delay is not an environmental impact. Therefore, even if there is a potential conflict with the general plan related to auto delay, under CEQA, that would not be considered a significant impact. Any other thoughts from the panel on that? Seeing none. Any other questions from the room on this topic? Seeing none. Chris, do you want to move on?
Yeah, great. Let's move on and talk about roadway projects were obviously in order to accommodate questions that don't fit neatly into these topics. We're not being perfect about following the topical, but if there are questions about roadway projects or transportation projects in general, now would be a great time for them. Anyone in the room? And have we gotten anything online? Nothing. Okay. Feel free to chime in with additional questions, folks in the room and online. Any questions about plans, rural thresholds, applying this to rural projects, the small project threshold and impacts to transit? Let's look at the room first. And did I see a hand on the panel? No, maybe just somebody stretching. Any questions in the room on any of those topics? Yes, please.
Thanks. Hi, Christopher Jordan, City of Elk Grove. As you can imagine, we're a community with fairly high VMT in comparison to the rest of the Sacramento region. So as we're addressing this, want to throw a hypothetical out that we've actually had a couple of applications on over the last few years. Two projects recently that were both over the maximum threshold for a categorical exemption for an infill project. These were sites about 8 to 15 or 18 acres in size each, residential in focus. They had general plan consistency walking in. Under the new guidelines, what sort of approach do we then need to be looking at for these sorts of things? Maybe we don't have a general plan update. We don't have any sort of comprehensive CEQA that's been done at a community-wide level to be able to say, well, there's a cumulative analysis. We just fall under that and can tier. Does that now push these sorts of projects that 6, 8, 12 months ago would have been really simple, straightforward exemption projects from a 15183 perspective, but now because of this issue are in a bigger ball of wax? Are we very honest, do we end up getting into an EIR circumstance for these projects just to go through the documentation, the legal components, as some of the panels have suggested, just to say, oh, it's significant, unavoidable, and override it?
A couple of quick observations on that. And again, this is not specific legal advice, of course, but the question was, can we still use something like 15183 where we streamline project review for individual projects from an analysis that was done at a general plan level? The short answer is that provision allows you to not repeat analysis that's already been done. So if that analysis, if the VMT analysis has not already been done with the general plan or some other document, then it would need to be done at the project level. I'll caution, though, that VMT has been studied as part of general plans for a long time, even if it hasn't been necessarily in the transportation section. It's been looked at, for example, in the greenhouse gas analysis section. It's been looked at in the energy impacts analysis. So there may still be analysis that one could draw from, even if it didn't necessarily appear in the transportation section. The other thing I would say is you would still be looking at, does the project fall within the presumption area? So might the project be located within a half mile of high quality transit? Not in your particular case, it looks like. The other issue is, even if you're doing this analysis, it's been relayed to us that a VMT analysis is much quicker to do than a typical level of service analysis. And there are mitigation measures that can be applied even if you fall above the recommended threshold area that might get you to below a level of significance. So you still might be processing a mitigated neg deck for a project, even if originally it had exceeded the threshold.
Any other responses from the panel, or do we have additional questions online?
There is a comment from David Schoenbrunn at TransDef, and he suggests that the literature shows a clear break at 1/4 mile for people who walk to transit. And if we are expanding to half mile, aren't we encouraging more driving for the outer 1/4 mile ring? He suggested in particular that Susan might weigh in on that. So Susan, is that a fair statement?
Well, I'm afraid I haven't looked at that literature in quite a while, so I'd have to go back and take a look. But yeah, I don't know that there's ever a clear break, right? It's a continuum. So yeah, I think I'd have to look again to say something more intelligent about whether the half mile versus quarter mile made sense. I know in my own work, you do see people walk a lot more than the assumed quarter mile distance, so.
Right, we have,
I'm comfortable with that.
this is Jeff Tumlin, we have some BART stations where the median walk distance is a mile. So in terms of an individual housing unit's propensity to generate walk trips to BART, naturally there is a decay curve that happens from distance to transit, but also the amount of area by distance, the area to distance ratio is based upon, pi times the radius squared, right? So the distance, as you get farther out from the station, there are more housing units per acre of distance, if that makes sense, or my geometric terms are failing me. So as Susan said, there's no clear break line. People will actually walk significant distances, but the influence of the rail station on the likelihood of any individual residential project or employment site to generate walk trips to and from transit does lessen with distance. We tend to use the half mile as the more relevant inflection point when we're measuring distance. Of course, the quality of the walk experience has a profound impact on really how far folks are willing to walk in any significant numbers.
And it's probably fair to say that continuum is going to evolve over time as infill happens more in communities, better,
Right. I was going to say, doesn't the availability of parking at the transit station probably play just as big of an influence on whether people would trade off driving to the station as the distance of walking?
And of course, the type of transit as well.
On that point, I would offer that in developing the presumption, OPR looked at other policy areas that have also pegged it to a half mile from transit, including SB743. So there is some consistency among policies that we're looking for. I'll also say that the evidence that we've looked at supports that presumption. So we have that's what we have recommended. Again, in the technical advisory, we clarify that there may be circumstances such as overparking or inability to actually get to the transit. Those things might take you out of the presumption. Any other questions from the room?
Great. Additional questions? Do we have any additional questions online? Okay. Questions from the panel. Does anybody have a question they want to introduce? You can just take a few minutes to let folks think. Have 26 minutes left to work with. We don't have to use it all, but we have it if we want it.
I'm curious as to what thought OPR staff has given to how you're going to monitor implementation. What venue you might use for refinements, venue mechanism you might use for refinements of these.
That's an excellent question, and thank you for asking that. One of the, as Chris Ganson mentioned at the outset, one of the big changes that we've made in this revised proposal is to take a lot of the detail out of the regulatory text and put it into a technical advisory. One of the reasons for doing that is that as we learn from implementation and as our models get better and our research gets better, we can update the technical advisory more quickly than we might be able to do with the CEQA Guidelines text itself. The other thing I'll say on that is with regard to the 2-year opt-in period, we at OPR have said that we are committed to monitoring implementation during that 2-year opt-in period so that we can revise the technical advisory if needed during that time.
Let me add two issues that haven't come up yet that I think are important for the listeners to keep in mind and could also warrant some support from OPR. One is on the topic of mitigation monitoring programs. So for projects that are in a challenging location, where the nature of the location doesn't help them meet their per capita VMT goal, there'll need to be a transportation demand management program response. And these are the sorts of programs that you don't just build once and walk away from. The most effective ones need to be monitored over time. There are a lot of EIRs here in California that have ongoing mitigation monitoring programs to make sure that whoever inherits the project maintains the programs that were committed to in the environmental document. And so some guidance to local jurisdictions that have never done mitigation monitoring programs before on how they work and some best practices, I think would be really helpful. They're not hard to do. There's just not all that many examples of ones that have been done really well. Another key topic that I think OPR could help support is improving impact fee programs. So something that many jurisdictions use CEQA for is as an exactions tool. In California, it is very easy to have a transportation impact fee. And transportation impact fees have the benefit that they get applied to all development projects. And they can be used, depending upon how you construct the fee, for all sorts of great citywide transportation improvements. CEQA as an exactions tool is really clumsy because you only get money from a project that trips a threshold, and you can only spend that money on specific, typically roadway widenings near the project. You can't use that money for systematic improvements to the transportation system. So impact fees are a fantastic underutilized tool in California. And again, providing some best practices to all jurisdictions in California about the fee programs that have been really successful, particularly the ones that fund multimodal improvements that reduce VMT, not just accommodate VMT, and how the nexus arguments were established for those fee programs so that local jurisdictions can do the same so that they can still have the resources that they need to improve their transportation programs even without level of service. In fact, under an impact fee program, you can still get money for all the roadway widenings you need, even if you can no longer use CEQA for that.
Another thought, an idea twice I am going to defer to Jeff on this and ask him a question. My experience is that oftentimes VMT mitigation impact trip generation, not just within the project, but well beyond. And that would be a really important.
That's right. There are a lot of jurisdictions around California that address project impacts by reducing vehicle trip generation unrelated to the project, right? So communities that have no net new trip requirements, including most recently in Mountain View, California, where developers are allowed to buy down their neighbors' motor vehicle trips in order to get additional entitlement themselves.
Yeah, this is Chris Ganson. I would just chime in. I mentioned during our slides that we are also developing the general plan guidelines, and we do provide recommendation for the same recommendation that you just made, Jeff, to look at impact fee programs, and in particular focus those on the transportation impact on VMT, but additionally providing some guidance on how to develop those programs. We can see the value in that. It's something we haven't gotten to yet, but we certainly have interest in.
Another thing I'd like to add to your list. So 743 resolves one of the key contradictions within CEQA, but we're left with a contradiction of the Congestion Management Act. And what the congestion management agencies around California will force local jurisdictions to do for the congestion management program corridors. So providing guidance to the existing congestion management agencies about how to address the tension that you all are creating between the CEQA requirements and the congestion management program requirements, but ultimately revising the Congestion Management Act itself so that the state congestion management agencies become one of the primary instruments for solving our traffic congestion problems by reducing vehicle miles traveled, rather than pretending that we can solve our congestion problems by widening roads.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask a corollary or follow-up question, and I'm going to direct it towards you, Mr. Attorney. Healthy. I'm guessing that there's a fair number of advocates in the room and online, and if there was someone from a local, regional, even statewide advocacy organization that a local jurisdiction that was in fact not implementing in an appropriate manner, what would be their
I would say that this is a change in CEQA, and so enforcement of CEQA remains the same as it always has been. And the CEQA statute relies on citizen enforcement for that. So engagement with local and state decision makers, and if necessary, through the court system. So that would be the same here.
I would add to that and say that, through OPR's work and work throughout the state, there is substantial evidence, supporting an argument that that VMT is a physical impact on the environment, and I think that the material is out there to push jurisdictions to make this change. One reason. Now that all of this is out there, one reason that we are very eager to go forward with this is that we feel it's important for the defensibility of our CEQA documents. So that's where we're coming from around it.
We did get it. Thank you. We did get another comment from the web. This comes from David Schombrun, again from TransDef. He suggests that an area that gets ignored in CEQA analysis typically is the impact of a project on the region, and that the types of impacts we're talking about here go way beyond just a single jurisdiction. How do our guidelines or our proposed materials address that issue?
Chris Ganson, I can give a start at answering that and value other opinions on the panel. So true, many trips cross jurisdiction boundaries, and we've provided explicit advice in our technical advisory that modeling exercises should follow those trips rather than truncating them at the jurisdictional boundary. So CEQA has a rule of reason. So we're not asking for anyone doing analysis to follow a single trip out of state or somewhere it might go, but to characterize vehicle travel reasonably, and that means when a substantial amount of it goes beyond a jurisdiction boundary to look at it and look at the vehicle travel beyond that boundary, include the VMT beyond that boundary, and that will typically look like a regional analysis. In some cases, it'll look like more than a regional and look like an extra regional analysis. There will be cases in which a substantial amount of vehicle travel from a project will travel across regional boundaries for a project right on the boundary of a region, for example, or a project, I can think of an example of a Silicon Valley jobs project, which will draw significant vehicle travel from the Central Valley. And it's important to look at the VMT, the total of the VMT, even when it crosses boundaries. So that's a first answer. If anybody else wants to add, feel free. Okay. Any additional questions online?
Not yet. I did want to come back to Mr. Tumlin's point about congestion management agencies. And I will say that we are certainly aware of that potential tension. And I will also say there has been some interest in the legislature in taking up that issue. Within the last couple of years, Assemblymember Bloom proposed some legislation that would update congestion management law. More recently, Assemblymember Garcia took up some amendments that would do that. So far, those haven't made it all the way through the process, but this is definitely a conversation that is worth having.
Great. So let's just open it up completely for general discussion. Are there any other questions in the room first? I see one.
Thank you. Neil Peacock, Local Development Intergovernmental Review Branch, Caltrans, statewide coordinator. I have a question regarding self-help counties and the self-help measures themselves. Most of them were put together before 743. Many of them are capital expansion programs, largely. Under CEQA with 743, there will be a requirement to look at the induced demand created by those improvements, and maybe you can help me articulate this question in a better way that maybe I am. Many jurisdictions may want to look at simply repackaging their suite of regional improvements to draw a connection, a mitigation connection between the system expansion projects that are part of a self-help measure versus doing an independent analysis and mitigation of those projects once they enter environmental clearance as individual capital projects. Is that, in your vision, allowable to use these other bicycle, pedestrian, transit investments as project-specific mitigation, or will those expansion projects need to undergo individual impact analysis and mitigation? Maybe we'll start with, is the question clear?
Yeah, I think it is clear, and thanks for that question. Certainly under CEQA, generally, we recommend when there are opportunities to look at impacts at a higher level and tier off those. That is generally can be beneficial and more efficient. The looking at transportation projects, a program of transportation projects, there are, I guess, a few needs in order to be sure that the analysis has been done fully. One is around the threshold. If there is if the plan and the aggregating of a project considers VMT in connection with our greenhouse gas targets. So we've supplied some recommendations for a methodology of how to get to a threshold based on the VMT that we as a state can have and still hit our greenhouse gas emissions targets. And again, those numbers haven't been completely settled, but we point to that method. So a more programmatic method could do the same. We would certainly observe that the analysis of VMT needs to be done generally at the project level, but it needs to be done at some level that allows for the analyses that come from it. For example, noise, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, those things that are affected by VMT. The VMT number will need to be known. Let's see. We would point to, in general, that existing case law requires the analysis of VMT, existing CEQA case law, but that could be done at the program level or at the individual project level. And a final point, that any analysis of a capacity project, a roadway capacity project, would need to factor in all of the sources of effect of that project, including longer trips, changes in route choices, changes in mode shift, where applicable, changes in actual trip generation, and last but very much not least, changes in land use patterns that result in changes in transportation patterns. So the program level analysis would need to be sensitive, would need to include sensitivity to the provision of roadway infrastructure on land use patterns, which then feeds back and creates differences in travel patterns in VMT. Any additional thoughts from the panel? Okay, thanks for the question. It's an important question. Any additional questions from online or, of course, the room? Still have about 8 minutes left if we want to use them.
I just have an observation to make, which is that, as probably everybody knows, SB743 also removed aesthetics and parking. That was essentially immediately effective. And we've really seen a pretty profound shift in the dialogue around CEQA review, even with that sort of less substantial change than what we're talking about right now, in that those issues continue to be discussed and questioned and kind of massaged around. I'm seeing a different tone around parking, even in San Francisco, where we do not have minimum parking requirements in a lot of parts of the city. There is a bigger and bigger shift away from providing a lot of parking in projects. The aesthetics discussion, again, by taking it out of CEQA, it has put that conversation much more into the realm of planning itself. And so I'm really hopeful about this change too around LOS and VMT. And I hope to see the CEQA conversations being more productive and the planning conversations being more productive too. So I am an optimist on this.
Thanks. And any last thoughts in the room or on the panel? And we hear any, or spread the opportunity for them, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up, unless we have any more questions showing up from online, which it looks like we don't. Terrific. Well, I want to thank everyone in the audience for attending, everyone who's watching the webcast for joining us. We, again, here, let me put our email addresses up on the screen. Chris Calfee and I, Chris Ganson, here are our email addresses if you want to contact us directly with questions or comments. We also, again, have our documents out for review through the end of this month, January 29th, and welcome your comments on that.
February 29th.
February 29th, sorry. Thank you for catching that mistake. And so we look forward to hearing your formal comments. Anything else?
No, again, I reiterate the thanks to our panel for joining us this morning and for everyone who joined us here in the room and on the webcast.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.